Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me. And okay, so today what I'm going to be talking about is the regime in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I want to look at how it's evolved, essentially since the first election that was held in 2006, which was the first election since 1960. First of all, I want to share a story with you of something that happened in the DRC, which helps to illustrate maybe some of the problems that there are. So it's the case of Andre Kasongo Ilunga, who was appointed the Minister for Foreign Trade in 2007. According to the Congolese government regulations, 2 candidates have to be proposed for any ministerial role. It was only after the appointment of Mr. Ilunga as the minister that everyone realized that he didn't actually exist as a person. He was in fact proposed as a dummy candidate by the leader of a small political party in order to get the position for himself. So in effect, what had happened was the Prime Minister had appointed someone who he'd never met and didn't even exist for one of the key and most senior positions in the administration. I think this really highlights for me that despite the apparent success of the elections in 2006, which were deemed to be relatively free and fair, opaque procedures and patronage networks rather than democratic institutions based on the rule of law continue to characterize the Congolese regime. Just a quick map of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in relation to the rest of Africa. And now I'll give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover in the presentation. So at the beginning, well, I'm going to examine the Congolese regime and how it's evolved under President Joseph Kabila, who's been in power since 2001, but I will actually take it from 2006 after the elections. The first thing that I will cover is different types of regime forms. So we'll look at democracy, dictatorship, and how, and also the competitive authoritarian regime form, which has been proposed. In the second part, I'm going to unpack the Congolese regime. First, I'll look at the electoral arena and how it changed from the 2006 elections and how the 2011 elections unraveled. Then I'm going to look at different areas of democratic contestation, such as the media, the legislature, and the judiciary. I will then briefly look at the different foundations of Congolese democracy, covering the legacy of corruption and patronage, which underpins the whole regime at the moment, the democratic movement, which dates back to the 1980s in the DRC, and the role of foreign aid. In the final section, I'm just going to look briefly at future directions that the regime might take. So first of all is the question of how to classify the Congolese regime, which is one of the main questions that I'm going to be looking at today. It's not really a democracy or a dictatorship, or I will argue, it's not even in transition. Like a lot of the time in democratic theory, there's this idea that it fits neatly into one of these 3 categories. But I'm actually going to argue that the Congolese regime, as it stands at the moment, does not meet the minimum standards for democracy as outlined by Stephen Levitsky and Lucian Way. These minimum standards are taken to be that the legislature and the executive are chosen in free and fair elections, that virtually all adults have the right to vote, that political rights, including freedom of the press and freedom to criticize the government, are protected, and that elected leaders have real authority to govern. While in a modern democracy these criteria might be violated, these violations are not broad or systematic enough to undermine democratic competition. The Congolese regime, I will argue, actually fits somewhere between democracy and dictatorship. I will argue that it actually can be better classified as competitive authoritarian. Competitive authoritarianism is a regime subtype that has been developed by Levitsky Way. It can be defined as competitive authoritarian regimes, are defined as civilian regimes in which democratic institutions exist and permit meaningful competition for power, but where the political playing field is so heavily tilted in the favour of the incumbents that the regime cannot be labelled as democratic. I'm now going to go into the specific case of the DRC. I'll give first a brief history of the political situation, and then I'm going to quickly go over the different areas of democratic contestation. So the political tradition in the DRC was established primarily under Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled between 1965 and 1997. During this period, a large volume of state revenue was siphoned off and fed into a very complex web of patrimonial networks which underpinned the whole system, and at all levels this was interspersed with corruption. For example, in 1992, none of the official state budget was spent on education or health services. Then in the 90s and early 2000s, there were back-to-back civil wars in the DRC, first from 1996 to 1997, then from 1998 to 2003. This led to what was essentially the complete collapse of the Congolese economy. I'm now going to go into the different areas of democratic contestation, starting with national elections. So the first elections since 1960 were held in 2006. There were 18 million voters who had their ballots accepted. Although there was no outright winner from the 33 different presidential candidates, in the second round of the presidential runoff, Joseph Kabila won 58% of the vote. Kabila's electoral support is mainly based in the Swahili-speaking east of the country, which continues to be overrun by conflict, and he doesn't have a support base in the west of the country, including Kinshasa. This tends to be pro-opposition. The 2006 election was judged as being generally free and fair, with high levels of competition by international observers. Although state resources were used and intimidation by Kabila was used to push the vote and the election in Kabila's favour, when you look at the amount of intense campaigning before the election and the competitive nature of the results, it's clear that it wasn't just a facade, that there was some level of democracy behind it. Just a quick note, the runner-up in the 2006 election, which was Jean-Pierre Bemba, in 2010, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. Now, looking at the 2011 elections, which happened in November last year, there were also just over 18 million ballots counted, and Kabila won in an outright victory with 49% of the vote. The second place, or the runner-up, was Etienne Tshisekedi, who won with 32% of the vote. And he has been involved in the democratic movement in the DRC for the last 30 years. The election had a lot of irregularities, and international observers have claimed that it lacked credibility, but the election results were not annulled. So there is still some credibility to them, maybe, or some evidence of democratic process. For example, some examples of the rigging were in Kabila's home village. More votes were actually counted than people were listed on the electoral roll. So I think there was actually 100.14% electoral turnout. Also within his constituency, there was only one person who voted for the main opposition candidate, Tshisekedi. There were also from Kinshasa, which was a stronghold of the pro-opposition candidate, only 1/5 of the polling stations, the results from these polling stations were actually counted. So 1/5 of the results from 1/5 of the polling stations in Kinshasa were lost. So it shows that, yes, it clearly skewed the election in favour of Kabila. There were calls from some of the opposition candidates for the vote to be cancelled. Tshisekedi himself actually came out and claimed victory in the election and aimed to be inaugurated by the people in a mass rally, but eventually, well, it is Kabila who is the president, and he was inaugurated. Recently, in August, there were some reports of a militia being set up in the centre of the DRC, trying to fight to put Tshisekedi into power as president. But from what's come out so far, they seem to be very disorganised, and although it's a worrying development, there doesn't seem to be much that's come of it to date. Also in the election, there were over 30 people who were killed. Most of these were targeted because they were pro-opposition, and there was also widespread violence and arrests of pro-opposition people. But generally, the level of violence was considered to be less than was expected. So just a brief overview. In the electoral arena, there was generally a high level of competition in both elections. The 2006 elections were considered to be free and fair. The 2011 elections lacked credibility, but not to the extent that they were annulled. Now we're going to turn to the media. So in the DRC, there's a diverse media, and discontent is regularly expressed through the media. However, Kabila has increasingly tried to cut down on the media as a forum for dissent through intimidation and arrest. Many journalists have been killed, and many have been arrested as well. Then to look at the legislature. The legislature actually had little role to play in the inter-electoral period. The opposition has been continually marginalised by the government. Also, this does also one of the other factors that play into the fact that they haven't played a very big role was that many of the parties went into the legislature only to get access to the spoils of office, as opposed to standing on a platform of issues of collective interest. However, there has been some contestation which has come through the legislature. For example, when you look at the members of parliament who are based in the east, when you have when Kabila was looking at joining up to the joint force of Operation Lightning Thunder against the Lord's Resistance Army in the east, which was a Ugandan-led operation. The MPs based in the east actually showed very strong opposition and put pressure on Kabila not to go through with it. And that's an important consideration to take into account when you consider, I think, the role of, what Kabila can do in the east in terms of military operations. And it's particularly important because his support base is based in the east. Then finally, on the judiciary. The judiciary is corrupt and tends to be packed with Kabila supporters. But this actually doesn't have too big an effect because the judiciary in general lacks any power and has virtually no funds invested into it. So it doesn't represent an arena for meaningful competition. Sorry about my PowerPoint down the bottom, it seems to be getting a bit cramped. So when you look at when I looked through all of these different elements, I came to the conclusion that the DRC can more effectively be classified as being competitive authoritarian. And I think when you look at it, you can really see that there is meaningful competition through the legislature, through the media, and through the electoral arena when you look at the last two elections. However, the level of electoral fraud, the repression of opposition figures, the inability of the judiciary to represent any meaningful check and balance on the government, and the targeting of media freedom means that it doesn't meet the minimum standards of democracy. I think you also, when you have a look at the difference between the 2006 election and the 2011 election, you can see a distinct authoritarian shift. So in the second section now, I'm going to have a look at how a number of different factors play into the regime. So I'm going to have a look at the complex patrimonial networks that underpin the regime. I'm going to look at the domestic democratic movement, changes in foreign aid, and an increase in Chinese investment. So first of all is the issue of corruption and patronage. Corruption and patronage underpin the system at every level of the administration and every level of the regime. Corruption and patronage dictate the allocations of key positions within the administration, and because of this corruption, the elected officials and the ruling elite actually work to undermine the development of transparent democratic institutions by not investing any political will or any funds into these institutions, because the development of strong democratic institutions may actually start to curtail some of the corruption and opportunities for patronage. Secondly, I'm going to look at the democratic movement. So democracy isn't just an imported concept that was imposed after the end of the Civil War. It actually has roots in Congolese society. In the 1980s, there was a democratic movement led by Etienne Tshisekedi, and despite the marginalization, and it still operated despite extreme marginalization by the Mobutu government and also the persecution by the government. However, this democratic movement was marginalized in the period up to and during the 2006 election. And I think from this you can see that this democratic movement was actually not the central factor behind the move towards democratization in the DRC. So when we're looking at it, we then have to look at where this pressure for democratization came from. I argue that one of the main factors was the massive financial and technical support given by Western international actors, but mainly Western donors. This massive investment was crucial for conducting elections, building infrastructure, stabilizing the Congolese economy, and financing the activities of the state. However, this foreign aid was conditional on, for the most part, was made conditional on democratic reform. So with you had high levels of aid, and that meant there were many opportunities for corruption within the administration. And this led the ruling elite to actually move to implement some of these democratic reforms, because to continue the high levels of easily corruptible foreign aid, they had to make some democratic reforms. Another factor is that it's relatively difficult in the international arena as it stands at the moment to portray yourself as actually being fully dictatorial. The status quo at the moment is towards quasi-democracies. So in order to get any form of political legitimacy, most governments have to show that they're actually implementing some democratic aspects. One of the problems that this creates, the fact that the Congolese democratization is built mainly on external pressure linked to foreign aid, as opposed to a domestic democratic movement, means that it becomes a lot more vulnerable to authoritarian drift. If this foreign aid goes down at all, then it has a tendency to lessen the incentives for the ruling elite to actually stick to it. Thank you. And just a final thing on this, I think another problem of having most of the democratization pressure coming from foreign aid is that most of the accountability that has been developed in the Congo, or the little that exists, actually is to international backers, whereas there's basically no accountability to the Congolese people themselves. Finally, I'm going to look at the question of whether there is an authoritarian shift going on within the Congolese regime. I think when you look at the competitive authoritarianism, it's quite a broad concept. So you have some regimes which are pretty close to being democratic, but not quite, whereas others are a lot further towards the authoritarian end of the spectrum. As a result, I think within the conceptual bounds of competitive authoritarianism, there is an ability to shift either in a democratic or an authoritarian direction. I think there's two key sources of pressure which could cause an authoritarian drift. One, as I mentioned before, is if you decrease the levels of foreign aid, there are less incentives from within the ruling elite to strengthen democratization. The second one is that you have a rapid increase in the last 5 years of politically unconditional Chinese investment, and this has started to challenge the monopoly that the West once had on influence in the Congo. So I think if you have the combination of a decrease in politically conditional foreign aid vis-a-vis a decrease, an increase in politically unconditional Chinese investment, you might see the regime start to shift in a more authoritarian direction. And just on the actual levels of aid and what's been happening with them, in the past few years there was a drop, but in 2012, both the US and the UK have increased their budgets, their foreign aid budgets for the DRC. Another issue with the regime is the longer that Kabila actually stays in office, the more he's able to strengthen his position through corruption and patronage networks. So this becomes a lot more entrenched and a lot harder for other competition to come through. So you actually see a gradual constraining of the different arenas of democratic contestation that I outlined at the beginning. A final issue is the sort of the unpredictability and the insecurity faced by the regime. For example, with Kabila, who has his main support base in the east, but the government is based in the west. So there's always this element of insecurity of somehow the divide in the country. Also, when you look at the resource-rich eastern section of the country, a lot of it's overrun by rebel factions. In a recent, one of the more recent events has been the M23 or M23 mutiny, which was a mutiny by different members of the Congolese armed forces. And they actually threatened the key city in the east, which is Goma, and it was found out that they had Rwandan backing, and foreign aid to Rwanda has been affected as a result by foreign donors in an attempt to try and curb the funding of rebel activities in the DRC. But this M23 mutiny very much threatens the credibility of the Kabila regime and also the position of the UN in the region. Also, you see in the last few months, you've seen the worst conflict to hit the region in the last 5 years. Because Kabila is dependent on the East for his electoral support, this continuing instability causes direct instability for the regime. It's also another reason why operations against the LRA become very politicized, because you're talking directly about Kabila's support base. So anything that happens there can undermine his support base. Finally, just a quick thing. There's a particularly poor investment climate at the moment, and this further weaks Kabila's position and his ability to feed into his patronage networks and build up support amongst his allies. If his position is weakened further, he may be pushed towards a more authoritarian direction, or on the contrary, it may actually push him to shore up support and political legitimacy by investing some of the country's wealth into improved macroeconomic management and social programs. Finally, I think it's just really important to look at what's happening with the Congolese regime. Due to the size and the influence of the DRC in the region, any changes in the direction of the Congolese regime will have important repercussions for security and development in the DRC, but also the Great Lakes region as a whole. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And while we get some more questions typed in there, we're also receiving questions offline. One quick thing, what do you think is the, or do you know, is the on-the-ground perception of, talk about foreign aid versus the internal patronage. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, you just dropped out a little bit in the middle for me. So can you repeat the question? I got, what are the perceptions on the ground of the differences between foreign aid and internal patronage? But just repeat the question so I get it down properly.
We're experiencing some network issues. I was trying to see if you had a feel for the differences in perceptions from the internal patronage versus the external foreign aid, and how that's viewed as the power shifts towards more democratic or more authoritarian type governments.
Unfortunately, I actually haven't been in the DRC, so my ability to let you know about well, I haven't been there in a research capacity or a working capacity, only as a tourist, so my ability to inform you about that is somewhat limited. It seems from the bit that I've talked to people in the DRC, the internal patronage is just taken as something that is so embedded in the system that it's really difficult to imagine a system in the DRC without that level of patronage, because it has had such a long history all the way through Mobutu's time, whereas the foreign aid is something relatively new. But I guess from the little bit I see, it hasn't been so fought against, maybe, because, I don't know, there just seems to be so many different levels of corruption, and everything seems to be incredibly corrupt. And sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but I'll leave it there and I'll take some other questions. Thank you.
Okay. No worries. We have a question here. It says, with all the corruption and inequality in the DRC, why, in your opinion, do the people of the DRC not rise up in opposition or overthrow Kabila and his cronies?
Well, I think part of the problem is sort of this acceptance of corruption and patronage, because it has been there for so long. But I think another thing is that that's essentially what started with the civil wars. In the early 90s, you saw different groups rising up against Mobutu and the different corruptions and the patronage and all of that was going on. And you saw different rebel factions coming in to overthrow the government. And so I think there's possibly a fear that if you see a mass rising up against Kabila, then it will turn into something that's incredibly violent across the whole country. And for me, when I saw the thing about this new militia, which is being talked about in the centre of the DRC, which is actually trying to put the pro-opposition, the opposition leader, Tshisekedi, into power, I think that has it has the potential to lead to, yes, possibly more democratic reform, but it also has the potential to lead to a lot more conflict in the region. And that's probably what people are quite scared of. I hope that answers the question. I also have another question here. Would you like me to read it out? Yep.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I just have a written question here. Claire mentioned something at one point about the criminal court, I presume at The Hague, as regards to the Kabila regime, but I couldn't hear her clearly. Can I speak more about that? So the brief thing that I was saying about the criminal court was that the former runner-up, or the runner-up in the 2006 election, has been tried at the International Criminal Court in The Hague for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and was found guilty in 2010. But you also see quite a lot of the different rebel factions or rebel leaders in the East, which have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. It's also interesting when you see the use of UN sanctions in the last few years, in the last sort of 2 years especially, that have been used strategically against rebel groups and rebel leaders operating in the East to essentially shore up support for the government by trying to make it more difficult for these rebel groups to operate. So I think 2 years ago, what you saw was, previous to that, there were more comprehensive sanctions across the DRC, and you saw them being more and more targeted towards the East, whereas the sanctions that were placed on the rest of the country have been relaxed. There's also one rebel leader called Nkunda, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court, who is currently under house arrest in Rwanda, and despite all of the sort of aims for, or the attempts by the Congolese government to get him to the International Criminal Court, he's been somewhat protected by the Rwandan government. I hope that's helpful.
I have one more question. I think we have some more coming in, but one of the slides towards the end spoke of external aid from China, specifically infrastructure projects, and how they seem to have no strings attached. Is there any pushback from the internal power structures against the Chinese or any of the external actors?
Just to clarify at the beginning, before I really answer your question, it's not so much external aid, it's not foreign aid from China, it's from state-owned enterprises generally, specifically a big mining investment called Sicko Mines. And what you see, so it's not directly from the government as such, it is to some extent private investment, but it's on a massive scale, and you see them investing in infrastructure and investing in hospitals and schools and things like this in return for access to the resources. As opposed to whether there has been a pushback from within the government, quite a lot of the ruling elite get a lot of kickbacks from it. So from then, there's probably been little, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm very sorry, but I can get it to you if you're interested. But I think there was a move by some of the MPs actually against the investment deal when it went through. But beyond that, I haven't seen any major pushbacks.
Okay, and I think we have just one last question from, let's see here. Do you think the international community should do more, pressure from the State Department, etc., to fight corruption?
I think ultimately, yes, they should. I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do in a context such as the DRC because it is so embedded. But I think, yes, there has to be more initiatives to fight corruption. I think there also has to be more initiatives to make the government more accountable to the Congolese people, as opposed to just being upwardly accountable to other international donors. I think that's a really key thing to moving democratic reform along, but also to improving the situation on the ground for different people. You have seen quite a few different initiatives come along in the last few years for fighting corruption, particularly in the mining industry and the extractive industries. Quite a lot of them have been blocked or stalled, or you'll see the DRC come out and give support initially, but not back it up with any institutional reform. So it's been very shallow. You also see some really interesting things coming along with the Dodd-Frank's reform, with the mining, to actually make it more transparent so looking at the other end, not just looking at the government, but looking at the private investors which are investing in the DRC to try and make them more transparent. But again, when it comes to any of these things of monitoring, also monitoring in a situation like the DRC, especially in the East where it's conflict-ridden, it becomes incredibly difficult. But I think, yes, there's still a very strong need for more anti-corruption measures and more pressure for more anti-corruption and more transparency initiatives.
All right. I think that's all the questions we have right now. I'd like to go ahead and thank Stephanie and Matti for making time for us today. And I do apologize for our technical difficulties, but we seem to have worked through them.
Great.